The vicar was never meant to hear it, just a few quiet words, spoken behind closed doors, but they were enough to turn a peaceful village into the scene of a deadly mystery. The village of Elmridge had a habit of becoming especially honest only after it had eaten too well. The harvest supper, held in the parish hall, had ended just before 10, which was considered respectable. The tables had been wiped down twice, once for appearance, once for conscience, and the last of the chairs had been stacked with the mild aggression of people who had smiled too long at relatives they did not choose. Outside, the air had the damp sweetness of crushed apples and wet wool. A faint mist clung to the hedges as though reluctant to leave without being formally dismissed. Inside the hall, however, something remained unsettled. It was not disorder exactly. Elmridge did not permit disorder on principle. It was more a residue of attention. The way conversations had paused a fraction too late. The way certain names had been spoken slightly softer than others. Inspector Geoffrey Purbright arrived after the event, which was his preferred timing for most village incidents. He had once remarked, with characteristic understatement, that people were far more informative once they had decided the crisis belonged to someone else. He stood just inside the doorway, observing the final exodus. Mrs. Larkin, chair of the flower committee, was explaining to no one in particular that she had noticed a tone during the pudding course. Mr. Henshaw, who owned the village hardware store and therefore believed himself structurally important to all civic stability, was arguing gently with a chair that refused to align with his moral expectations. The vicar, Reverend Samuel Crowthorne, remained near the lectern. He had not yet left. That, in itself, was noted. Purbright did not move immediately. He rarely entered a room as though he belonged to it. Instead, he allowed it to adjust to his presence, like a conversation slowly remembering a missing detail. The vicar eventually noticed him. "Inspector," he said, with relief that felt rehearsed, "you did say you might pass by." "I did not specify when," Purbright replied. "It seemed safer that way." A faint smile appeared on the vicar's face, then withdrew as though reconsidering its own appropriateness. The hall was almost empty now. Only the smell of roast potatoes and polished wood remained, along with the faint echo of conversations that had decided not to resolve themselves. "I was hoping," the vicar said carefully, "that we might speak about something that occurred earlier." Purbright glanced at the hall as though it might confess first. "Something occurred at most village events," he said. "It is part of their charm. This was not part of the program." That detail, delivered with ecclesiastical restraint, carried more weight than the vicar intended. Purbright stepped further inside. At this closer range, he noticed the vicar's hands were not steady in the way of fatigue. They were steady in the way of someone deliberately preventing themselves from becoming unsteady. "I assume," Purbright said, "this concerns the supper." "In part," the vicar replied. "But more precisely, what was said during it?" Purbright waited. He had learned long ago that silence was not emptiness in villages like Elmridge. It was storage. The vicar glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice, though there was no one left to overhear except the furniture. "There was a moment," he said, "between the main course and the pudding, when the room was distracted." "A dangerous time," Purbright observed. The vicar did not smile this time. "One of the parishioners, someone I would prefer not to name, yet leaned toward me and said something that did not make sense in isolation. But afterwards," he hesitated, "afterwards, I realized it might have been part of something larger." Purbright shifted slightly, as though adjusting his interest into a more comfortable position. "You are suggesting a pattern." "I am suggesting," the vicar corrected gently, "that I may have heard something I was not meant to hear." The phrasing was important. Purbright noted it without comment. From the corner of the hall, a door creaked. Mrs. Larkin had returned briefly, apparently to retrieve a forgotten serving spoon. She paused when she saw them, then decided the spoon could remain spiritually lost for another evening. When she left again, the silence felt heavier. Purbright turned back to the vicar. "Tell me exactly what was said." The vicar exhaled through his nose, a small act of composure. "It was not a complete sentence," he said. "That is part of the difficulty. It began as a remark about the allotments, something about the fencing being not what it was before the agreement." Purbright nodded slightly. "That would interest several people," he said. "Yes," the vicar agreed, "but then it changed. The tone changed, and the person." He stopped. Purbright did not hurry him. He had found that urgency rarely improved recollection. It merely improved invention. "The person," the vicar continued, "said, 'You know very well what happened after the ledger was corrected.'" The hall seemed, for a moment, to tighten around the sentence. Purbright repeated it quietly, as though testing its structure. "The ledger was corrected." "Yes. And you are certain of the wording?" "As certain as one can be when one is simultaneously carving roast potatoes and preventing two parishioners from arguing about compost." Purbright allowed himself a faint expression that might have been amusement, or merely alignment of thought. "And your concern," he said, "is not the sentence itself. It is what it implies." The vicar nodded once. "Because," he said, more quietly now, "no ledger correction was announced." Purbright looked past him toward the empty tables. Village life, in his experience, did not produce secrets in dramatic fashion. It produced them like mildew, slowly, quietly, and with an insistence that they had always been there. He stepped closer to the lectern. On it lay the remains of the evening's program: hymn sheets, a list of produce donated by parishioners, and a folded note that had not been part of the official arrangement. He did not touch it yet. Instead, he asked, "Who spoke the sentence?" The vicar hesitated again. Longer this time. When he answered, his voice had lowered to something almost apologetic. "I think," he said, "it was Mr. Calder." At that name, something shifted not in the room, but in the way the vicar held himself, as though he had finally admitted the shape of the concern rather than its outline. Purbright noted it. Then, very calmly, he said, "We should talk about Mr. Calder's understanding of ledgers." And for the first time that evening, the vicar looked as though he regretted staying after supper at all. The vestry of St. Anselm's had never been designed for secrecy, which was precisely why it had acquired so much of it. It was a narrow, functional room, built in the late Victorian period, when practicality was still mistaken for modesty. The walls held coats, registers, spare hymn books, and the quiet resignation of people who had once volunteered for committees and never quite escaped them. Inspector Purbright stood in the doorway for a moment longer than strictly necessary, as though allowing the room to confirm it still existed in a lawful state. Reverend Crowthorne was already inside, hovering near a shelf of parish records. He had the expression of a man who trusted paper more than memory, but not entirely. "I should clarify," the vicar said, "that Mr. Calder is not, strictly speaking, a problematic individual." Purbright nodded politely, as if this categorization had been anticipated. "In villages," Purbright said, "that usually means the opposite." A faint pause followed, during which the vicar considered defending his community and decided instead to adjust a ledger that did not require adjustment. Purbright turned his attention to the far wall. It was there that the room changed slightly, not visibly, not in any dramatic architectural sense, but in the way sound behaved. Conversations in the vestry did not end. They faded into the wall and seemed to continue thinking about themselves. "You mentioned a whisper," Purbright said. "Yes," the vicar replied. "That is one way of putting it." Purbright waited. The vicar walked a few steps toward the center of the room, then stopped, as though unsure whether proximity improved honesty or merely increased responsibility. "It was during the clearing of the hall," he said. "After most people had gone, I had returned here to check the donation register. Someone came in behind me. Mr. Calder? I did not see him enter, the vicar admitted. Only heard him. Purbright's gaze shifted slightly. That is not the same thing, he said. No, the vicar agreed. Which is why I have been trying to decide whether I actually heard him at all. The inspector allowed this ambiguity to remain uncorrected for the moment. Instead, he stepped closer to the wall, where the sound seemed to settle. Tell me exactly what you heard, he said. The vicar hesitated, as though the sentence still had weight. It was very brief, he said. Just a few words. Something about putting things back where they belong. Then, after a pause, not everything survives correction. Purbright did not respond immediately. Outside the vestry window, the village continued its ordinary business of pretending nothing had happened. A cat crossing a low stone wall, a distant gate closing, the faint shuffle of someone who had forgotten why they had stepped outside. In what tone was it spoken? Purbright asked. The vicar frowned slightly. That is difficult, he said. It did not feel like anger nor confession, more like instruction that had arrived late. Purbright accepted this without comment, as though delayed instruction were a recognized category of speech. He turned his attention to the parish register on the table. Its pages were neat, carefully maintained. Names aligned with dates, contributions recorded with a kind of moral tidiness. Who has access to these? He asked. The churchwarden, the vicar replied. Mrs. Henshaw assists, and I, of course. Purbright flipped one page gently. And Mr. Calder? A slight hesitation. He audits, the vicar said, carefully choosing the verb as though it might object. On behalf of the parish council? Yes. Purbright closed the register without haste. Auditing is an interesting word, he observed. It suggests correction without ownership. The vicar seemed unsettled by this interpretation, but did not challenge it. A knock came at the vestry door. Not urgent, not polite either. Something in between, administrative perhaps. The door opened before permission could be granted. Mrs. Henshaw entered. She carried a small stack of folded cloths and the expression of someone who had already decided that the evening was deteriorating beyond salvage. I thought I might find you both here, she said. Her eyes moved briefly between Purbright and the vicar, registering position, alignment, and implied consequence. I hope I am not interrupting anything ecclesiastical, she added. Only recollection, Purbright replied. Mrs. Henshaw accepted this without surprise. Then, I may be too late already. She placed the cloths on a chair and remained standing, as though unwilling to sit in a room that might later be quoted. I assume, she said, this is about what was said after supper. The vicar glanced at her with visible caution. You heard something as well? He asked. I heard people, she corrected, which is not the same thing, but often leads to it. Purbright studied her briefly. And your interpretation? He asked. Mrs. Henshaw gave a small, controlled sigh. My interpretation, she said, is that Mr. Calder has been using language that makes other people feel as though they have forgotten agreements they never agreed to forget. A pause followed this, during which no one offered correction. Purbright leaned slightly against the table. Agreements, he repeated. Yes, Mrs. Henshaw said. The allotments, the fencing arrangements, the redistribution notes. The vicar frowned. There were no redistribution notes, he said. That depends, Mrs. Henshaw replied evenly, on which version of the ledger you are reading. The word landed quietly, but it did not leave the room. Purbright turned his head slightly. Version, he said. Mrs. Henshaw met his gaze without hesitation. I would not normally say this, she added, but the parish records have not been identical for some time. The vicar looked sharply at her now. That is a serious assertion. It is a careful one, she replied. There is a difference. Purbright straightened. Who altered them? He asked. Mrs. Henshaw did not answer immediately. When she did, Her voice carried none of the certainty of accusation, only the discomfort of observation. "I do not know," she said, "but I do know when it started." She looked toward the wall, almost unconsciously. The week after Mr. Calder began reviewing the accounts, the vestry, already small, seemed to contract further around this information. Purbright's expression remained mild, but his attention sharpened in a way that was not visible unless one had spent time watching him think. "The ledger correction," he said quietly. The vicar looked between them. "You are suggesting," he said carefully, "that something was changed deliberately." Mrs. Henshaw answered before Purbright did. "I am suggesting," she said, "that in Elmridge, people do not usually disagree about what they believe they agreed to." Purbright looked back at the parish register. Then, almost gently, he asked, "Where does Mr. Calder keep his copies?" The vicar hesitated. "He would say," he replied, "that he keeps none." Mrs. Henshaw gave a faint, humorless exhale. "Mr. Calder says many things," she said, "that improve upon the truth's appearance." Outside, a gust of wind pressed lightly against the vestry window, as though testing whether it might be admitted. Inside, no one moved for a moment. Then Inspector Purbright reached for the register again, and this time he opened it to the first page, as though deciding that whatever had been corrected might still be found where it began. Reverend Crowthorne had never liked mornings that began with clarification. They tended, in his experience, to suggest that the previous evening had been more truthful than intended. He stood now in the small office adjoining the vestry. Staring at the same parish register Inspector Purbright had examined earlier, as though it might revise itself out of embarrassment. Purbright himself sat with quiet patience, not appearing especially interested in the room, which made him more difficult to refuse. Mrs. Henshaw had already left. She had done so with the efficiency of someone who believed her presence improved matters only briefly before they deteriorated again. The vicar spoke at last. "I have been thinking," he said. "That is usually the problem," Purbright replied mildly. The vicar accepted this without offense. "It is about Mr. Calder," he continued, "and what I may have assumed about him." Purbright looked up, but not sharply. Encouragement in his manner rarely resembled encouragement. "Go on," he said. The vicar hesitated, then moved to the window as though the village outside might offer correction. "When he first arrived on the parish council," he said, "he was precise. Uncomfortably so, at times, but useful. He identified inconsistencies in the accounts, small ones, almost negligible." "Almost," Purbright repeated. "Yes." The vicar folded his hands behind his back. "At the time," he continued, "it seemed like diligence. Now I wonder whether it was something else." Purbright did not interrupt. He had learned that doubt, once properly warmed, tended to speak for itself. "The first alteration to the register," the vicar said, "was not obvious, a donation recorded twice, then corrected, or so I believed." Purbright tilted his head slightly. "And now you are less certain." "I am uncertain whether I ever saw the correction at all," the vicar admitted. A faint silence followed. Outside, a delivery cart moved slowly past the churchyard gate, its wheels making the kind of sound that belonged to an earlier century and refused to modernize. Purbright stood and approached the desk. "Memory fails in two useful ways," he said. "It removes things that are inconvenient, and it adds things that make us feel consistent." The vicar looked uncomfortable, but not offended. "I am not inventing this," he said quietly. "I did not suggest you were," Purbright replied. That, somehow, did not ease the tension. He opened the register again. "Tell me about Mr. Calder's manner," he said. "Not his actions, his manner." The vicar frowned, thinking. "He is controlled," he said at last. "Not cold, exactly, but resistant to emotional drift. He prefers conclusions to remain stable once reached." Purbright nodded as though this were a known species. And how do others respond to that? A faint, reluctant smile touched the vicar's face. Poorly, he said, but politely. Purbright closed the register. Politeness is often mistaken for agreement, he observed. The vicar did not disagree. A knock came again, sharper this time. Before either man could respond, the door opened. This time, it was not Mrs. Henshaw. It was Mr. Henshaw. He stood in the doorway holding a rolled-up sheet of paper as though it had been arguing with him during the walk. I apologize, he said immediately, though not for entering. But this concerns the allotments. Purbright's gaze shifted slightly. Everything here does, he said. Mr. Henshaw stepped inside without waiting further invitation. There is confusion, he said. Or rather, there is disagreement about what was agreed. The vicar exchanged a glance with Purbright that suggested resignation was beginning to form into habit. Between whom? The vicar asked. Between everyone, Mr. Henshaw replied, with the calm frustration of someone describing weather. He unrolled the paper on the desk. It was a map, or at least it had once been one version of a map. Now it carried annotations, corrections, and faint traces of earlier certainty. The fencing lines, Mr. Henshaw continued, do not match the current usage. Some plots are being treated as though they were reassigned. Purbright studied the document without touching it. And who reassigned them? He asked. Mr. Henshaw hesitated. That is the problem, he said. No one admits to doing it, yet everyone is acting as though it was properly authorized. The vicar leaned forward slightly. That would require documentation, he said. It did require documentation, Mr. Henshaw corrected. And there was documentation. I saw it months ago. Purbright looked up. And now? Mr. Henshaw's expression tightened. Now it appears to have been replaced. The word hung in the room longer than it should have. Purbright spoke quietly. Replaced, he repeated. Mr. Henshaw nodded once. Not missing, he said. Not lost. Replaced with a version that is almost identical, except for 3 boundary lines. The vicar's voice was softer now. Who has authority over such records? Mr. Henshaw glanced at him. The parish council's secretary keeps the copies, he said, and Mr. Calder oversees verification. At the mention of the name, the room seemed to settle into a shared silence, as though acknowledging a recurring presence. Purbright turned back to the map. Have you confronted him? He asked. Mr. Henshaw gave a small, reluctant shake of the head. No, he said. One does not confront Mr. Calder. One seeks clarification, which he provides very efficiently. The tone of this statement carried its own warning. The vicar looked increasingly uneasy. He has been spoken about, he said quietly, but not questioned. Mr. Henshaw glanced at him. That is because questioning him tends to produce more certainty than one had before, he said. Purbright's expression softened slightly, though whether in amusement or recognition was unclear. An interesting skill, he said. A pause followed. Then, almost reluctantly, Mr. Henshaw added, There is something else. Purbright did not prompt him. Mr. Henshaw lowered his voice. The ledger correction Mr. Calder referred to last night. I heard that phrase before. The vicar looked up sharply. Where? At the council meeting, Mr. Henshaw said. 2 weeks ago, during a discussion about reallocations. He hesitated. It was not recorded in the minutes. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was simply heavier than before. Purbright looked at the map again. Then, very calmly, he said, It seems we are dealing with a village that has developed alternative versions of its own agreement. The vicar's voice was barely above a whisper. And which version is true? Purbright folded his hands behind his back. That, he said, is usually the question people ask only after they have already benefited from one of them. And for the first time that morning, no one in the room offered a polite disagreement. The parish council room had been arranged to suggest neutrality, though it had never quite achieved it. Its long table, polished to an almost suspicious sheen, reflected faces in a way that made every expression look like it had been previously approved. The chairs were mismatched, as though disagreement had once been expected but later discouraged. Inspector Purbright sat slightly apart from the centre, which was where most arguments believed they belonged. Reverend Crowthorne remained near the window, as though proximity to daylight might soften whatever was about to be said. Mr. Henshaw stood by the table, with the map still rolled under his arm, though now he handled it like something that might remember being altered. Mrs. Henshaw had returned because, as she later explained, absence only allowed other people to become confidently incorrect. And Mr. Calder had arrived last. He did not enter a room so much as settle it. There was nothing theatrical about him. He wore no obvious authority, yet the atmosphere adjusted in small increments, as though recognizing a familiar administrative principle. "Inspector," Mr. Calder said politely. "Mr. Calder," Purbright replied. Neither tone suggested surprise. The vicar cleared his throat gently. "We are here," he said, "to clarify matters regarding the parish records and the allotment boundaries." Mr. Calder nodded once. "A useful clarification," he said. "Clarity is often mistaken for agreement, but it is not the same thing." Mrs. Henshaw's expression tightened slightly at that, though she said nothing. Purbright leaned forward a fraction. "Let us begin simply," he said. "There are two versions of certain records in circulation." Mr. Calder did not react immediately. Then he said, "That is not unusual." Mr. Henshaw shifted his stance. "It is unusual when both versions are being acted upon simultaneously," he said. A faint pause followed, during which Mr. Calder looked at him as though considering whether this observation required correction or refinement. "It depends," Mr. Calder said at last, "on which actions you consider authoritative." The vicar blinked once. "That is precisely the concern," he said, carefully. Purbright watched Mr. Calder now, with the mild attentiveness of someone observing a man who had never needed to raise his voice because the room had already agreed to listen. "Tell me about the ledger correction," Purbright said. Mr. Calder nodded slightly, as though acknowledging a phrase that had already been properly defined elsewhere. "A correction is simply the restoration of accuracy," he said. "To what?" Mrs. Henshaw asked, before she could decide not to. Mr. Calder turned his attention to her. "To what was originally agreed," he replied. Mr. Henshaw gave a short, humorless exhale. "That assumes agreement has a single origin," he said. Mr. Calder looked at him. "Most agreements do," he said calmly. Purbright interjected gently. "And if someone disagrees about the origin?" Mr. Calder's expression did not change. "Then they are remembering a different meeting," he said. The room absorbed this without immediate reply. Even the vicar seemed momentarily uncertain whether theology or accounting had been insulted. Purbright stood slowly. "You oversee verification of parish documents," he said. "I review them," Mr. Calder corrected. "Semantics aside," Purbright continued, "do you maintain copies?" Mr. Calder shook his head once. "That would defeat the purpose," he said. A faint stir moved through the room at that answer, though no one wished to acknowledge it directly. Mrs. Henshaw spoke again, more carefully this time. "Then how do you compare versions?" Mr. Calder regarded her as though the question itself required calibration. "I do not compare versions," he said. "I ensure that only one remains active." A silence followed that felt slightly misaligned, as though it had been placed too early in the conversation. The vicar spoke quietly. "And what determines which one remains?" Mr. Calder turned his gaze to him. "Accuracy," he said simply. Mr. Henshaw stepped forward, unable to fully contain himself now. "Then why do people believe they saw different allotment boundaries months ago?" he asked. Mr. Calder paused. "Not dramatically, not defensively, just long enough for attention to settle." "Because they did," he said. That answer did not simplify anything. It complicated it in a very specific way. Purbright observed this carefully. Yet those boundaries no longer exist in the current records, he said. Mr. Calder inclined his head. Because they were incorrect, he replied. Mrs. Henshaw's voice tightened. Incorrect according to whom? Mr. Calder answered without hesitation. According to the corrected ledger. The vicar's hands folded together more tightly. I think, he said slowly, we are circling something we do not fully understand. Purbright allowed a faint pause before responding. That is often how villages maintain stability, he said. Mr. Henshaw tapped the rolled map lightly against his palm. There is something else, he said again, more firmly. All eyes shifted to him. He unrolled the map on the table. This time he did not point immediately. Instead, he simply let it exist between them. These boundary lines, he said, match neither current usage nor the version from last spring. He looked at Mr. Calder. They match a version I saw only once, at a subcommittee meeting, before it was withdrawn. Mr. Calder regarded the map without moving closer. That version, he said, was provisional. Mr. Henshaw's voice sharpened. It was not labelled provisional at the time. Mr. Calder replied evenly. Then it should have been. The vicar looked increasingly troubled now. You are saying, he said slowly, that documents exist in stages, and only one stage is permitted to persist. That is one way of describing it, Mr. Calder agreed. Purbright folded his hands behind his back again. And the others? He asked. Mr. Calder considered this. They are not retained, he said. Deleted? Mrs. Henshaw asked. Mr. Calder shook his head slightly. Reconciled, he said. That word lingered. Not because it was unclear, but because it sounded complete without explaining itself. Purbright looked down at the map again. Then he said, very quietly, And when was the last reconciliation carried out? For the first time, Mr. Calder hesitated in a way that did not feel procedural. Shortly after the harvest supper, he said. The room shifted subtly at that timing. The vicar's face tightened. And the sentence I overheard, he said, almost unwillingly, about the ledger being corrected. Mr. Calder looked at him. Yes, he said. The vicar swallowed. You were referring to that evening. I was referring, Mr. Calder corrected gently, to the moment when accuracy was restored. Purbright studied him for a long moment. Then he said, without raising his voice, or the moment when something stopped being allowed to remain incorrect. No one responded immediately. Outside, the village remained quietly committed to its own version of order. Inside, the parish council room had begun to feel less like a place where decisions were made and more like a place where only one version of decisions was permitted to survive them. Mrs. Larkin believed tea solved nothing, but it made nothing easier to ignore, which was often sufficient. She arranged the cups in the church hall kitchen with the precision of someone who distrusted both accidents and people who claimed not to notice them. Inspector Purbright accepted his cup without comment. He did not drink it immediately, which Mrs. Larkin interpreted as either caution or judgment. She disliked both equally. Reverend Crowthorne stood near the counter, as though the kettle might offer a confession if approached correctly. Mr. and Mrs. Henshaw had arrived together but were standing apart, which in Elmridge was usually considered a sign of unity under strain. Mr. Calder was not present. This absence, nobody mentioned directly, had already begun to influence the shape of the room. You will forgive me, Mrs. Larkin said, breaking the silence with the careful tone of someone testing a weak floorboard. But I do not understand why everything has become about ledgers, Mrs. Henshaw replied without looking up. Because everything has become about ledgers. That is not helpful, Mrs. Larkin said. It is accurate, Mr. Henshaw muttered. Purbright finally stirred his tea once, as though acknowledging its existence was a social obligation rather than a preference. The difficulty, he said mildly, is not the ledger itself. Mrs. Larkin narrowed her eyes slightly. There is more than one? A faint pause followed. The vicar answered. There appears to be more than one version of certain records, he said carefully. Mrs. Larkin exhaled through her nose. Well, she said, that explains why nothing agrees with anything else this week. Purbright looked at her. That implies, he said, this is not new. Mrs. Larkin hesitated. It is new in intensity, she said finally, not in principle. That answer, though unintended as evidence, settled uncomfortably in the room. Mrs. Henshaw set her cup down. I would like to know where Mr. Calder is, she said. Mr. Henshaw gave a short shrug. Likely reviewing something, he said, or correcting it. The vicar frowned. He did not stay after the council meeting, he said. Purbright's attention sharpened slightly. Did anyone see him leave? A pause. Then Mrs. Larkin said, He left before I finished stacking the pudding plates. That is not the same as seeing him leave, Mrs. Henshaw pointed out. Mrs. Larkin bristled faintly. I would have noticed if he had not left, she said. Purbright nodded, as though this was an important distinction, though not necessarily a reliable one. And yet, he said quietly, he is absent now when the discussion concerns his work. Mr. Henshaw tapped his fingers lightly on the table. That is not unusual, he said. He rarely attends discussions about his own conclusions. Mrs. Henshaw gave him a sideways look. That is because he treats conclusions as independent of discussion, she said. The vicar shifted slightly. I think, he said, we may be misunderstanding his role. Purbright looked at him. That is always possible, he agreed. Outside, a faint wind pressed against the windows, making the glass sound briefly, like it had remembered something unpleasant. Mrs. Larkin poured more tea no one had requested. There is also, she said, hesitantly, the matter of what was overheard. The room quietened in a different way, now less conversational, more attentive. Purbright did not ask who she meant. He already knew the answer would not be singular. Mrs. Henshaw spoke first. You are referring to the remark at supper. Mrs. Larkin nodded. I was near the serving table, she said. I heard something about corrections and what cannot be kept twice. The vicar's expression tightened. That phrase again, he murmured. Mr. Henshaw looked up. I heard a variation of it at the allotment gate last week, he said. Before any of this became structured, Purbright set his cup down at last. And what was the context? He asked. Mr. Henshaw hesitated. It was a conversation between Mr. Calder and Mr. Denton, he said, about fencing lines. Mrs. Henshaw frowned. Mr. Denton does not usually involve himself in council matters. He did that day, Mr. Henshaw replied. Briefly, Purbright's tone remained even. What did you hear? Mr. Henshaw considered carefully. Mr. Denton said something about not recognizing the current boundaries, he said. Mr. Calder replied that recognition was not the same as validity. The vicar closed his eyes briefly, as though that sentence had become physically heavy. Mrs. Larkin frowned. That sounds like nonsense, she said. It sounded quite clear at the time, Mr. Henshaw replied. Mrs. Henshaw leaned forward slightly. And afterwards? Mr. Henshaw hesitated. Afterwards, he said slowly, Mr. Denton stopped attending allotment meetings. A silence followed this. Not dramatic, simply settled. Purbright looked down at the table. And no explanation was recorded for his absence, he said. Mrs. Henshaw shook her head. No? The inspector nodded once, as though filing that away in a place that did not require visible storage. The vicar spoke quietly. If Mr. Denton disagreed with a correction, he said, what does that imply about the correction itself? No one answered immediately. Mrs. Larkin broke the silence first, more softly now. It implies, she said, that someone decides what disagreement is allowed to remain. The room did not challenge her. Purbright rose slowly. I think, he said, we should revisit the original ledger. Mrs. Henshaw frowned. We have seen the current version. I did not say the current version, Purbright replied. He paused briefly. I said the original. A A faint unease moved through the group, not fear, but the discomfort of realizing that original might not be a stable concept in Elmridge anymore. The vicar spoke. "I am not certain we still have access to it." Purbright looked at him calmly. "That," he said, "is precisely why we should find out." And for the first time since the harvest supper, the conversation stopped being about what had been said and became about what might no longer exist to contradict it. The bell tower of St. Anselm's was not designed for comfort, hospitality, or anything resembling reflection. It existed for function alone, which made it unusually honest compared to the rest of the village. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rope, dust, and old discipline. Mr. Denton stood near the bell mechanism with his sleeves rolled up, as though preparing for an argument he had already lost once before. He was a man whose hands suggested repetition, while his expression suggested regret about it. Inspector Purbright climbed the narrow stairwell with measured patience. Reverend Crowthorne followed, slightly more breathless, as though elevation carried moral consequences. Mr. Denton acknowledged them, without surprise. "I assume this is about the meeting," he said. Purbright stopped just short of the bell rope. "It usually is," he replied. A faint, humorless exhale came from Mr. Denton. "I stopped attending," he said. "So I would have thought I was no longer relevant." "That is rarely how villages interpret absence," Purbright said mildly. The vicar glanced at Mr. Denton with careful concern. "You were mentioned," he said. Mr. Denton nodded once, as though this confirmed a private suspicion. "Then something has been misrepresented," he said. Purbright studied him. "That depends," he replied, "on what you think was represented correctly in the first place." A pause followed, during which the bell rope swayed slightly, though no one had touched it. Mr. Denton turned away from it, as though unwilling to allow it emotional leverage. "I assume you want me to explain the allotment situation," he said. "I assume," Purbright replied, "you will choose what you believe is relevant." Mr. Denton gave a short nod. "That is fair." He walked a few steps along the timber floor, then stopped. "The first version I saw," he said, "was straightforward. Clear divisions, established usage patterns, nothing controversial." Purbright said nothing. Mr. Denton continued. "Then Mr. Calder arrived with the revised allocations. He called them corrections." The vicar frowned slightly. "And you disagreed?" "I did not immediately understand them," Mr. Denton corrected. "That is not the same thing," Purbright noted. Mr. Denton looked at him briefly. "No," he agreed, "it is not." He paused, but understanding came later. "And what did you conclude?" Purbright asked. Mr. Denton hesitated. "That my plot had been reduced," he said finally. The vicar shifted uncomfortably. "Reduced? According to what measure?" Mr. Denton gave a faint shrug. "According to the revised ledger." Purbright's expression remained neutral. "And before that revision?" Mr. Denton frowned. "Before that, I had a larger plot," he said, "as per the earlier document." The vicar spoke carefully. "Do you still have a copy of that earlier document?" Mr. Denton shook his head. "No," he said. Purbright watched him closely now. "Why not?" Mr. Denton hesitated longer than before. "Because I was told it had been superseded," he said. "By whom?" the vicar asked. Mr. Denton looked briefly uncomfortable. "Mr. Calder," he said. A silence settled. Not heavy, but precise. Purbright leaned slightly against a beam. "And you accepted that?" Mr. Denton gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "I was shown the updated version," he said. It matched what others were using. Mrs. Henshaw's voice, from behind them, carried up the stairwell. She had followed quietly. "Which others?" she called. Mr. Denton turned slightly. "Those who remained in the system," he replied. Mrs. Henshaw stepped fully into view now, her expression sharpened by impatience. "That is not an answer," she said. "It is the only one I have," Mr. Denton replied. Purbright raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to slow the exchange before it became localized conflict. "There is something I would like clarified," he said. He looked at Mr. Denton. "You said your understanding came later." Mr. Denton nodded. "When?" Mr. Denton hesitated. "After I stopped attending meetings." Purbright nodded slowly. "And what prompted you to stop attending?" A faint shift occurred in Mr. Denton's posture. "That is not easy to explain," he said. "Try," Purbright replied gently. Mr. Denton looked down at his hands. "I was told," he said, "that my attendance was no longer required because my records were inconsistent with the corrected ledger." The vicar frowned. "Inconsistent how?" Mr. Denton's voice lowered slightly. "They said I was referencing outdated boundaries." Purbright straightened slightly. "Who told you that?" Mr. Denton hesitated again. "Mr. Calder," he said. Mrs. Henshaw exhaled sharply. "And you simply stopped attending?" Mr. Denton looked up at her. "I was not barred," he said carefully. "I was no longer necessary." The word hung uncomfortably. Purbright looked at the bell rope again. "And since then," he said, "you have had no further communication about your allotment?" Mr. Denton shook his head. "No direct communication," he said. The vicar frowned. "And indirect?" Mr. Denton hesitated. "There were notices posted," he said, "but they referred to the revised allocations only." Purbright nodded slowly. "And the earlier version?" Mr. Denton's expression tightened slightly. "It was no longer referenced," he said. A silence followed, different from before. Less conversational, more structural. Mrs. Henshaw spoke quietly. "So the earlier version simply stopped existing in practice." Mr. Denton did not disagree. Purbright stepped closer to the bell mechanism. "When was the last time the bell was rung for a council meeting?" he asked. Mr. Denton blinked. 2 weeks ago," he said, "after the harvest supper." The vicar glanced at him sharply. "Did you attend that meeting?" Mr. Denton shook his head. "No?" he said. Purbright turned slightly. "Then how do you know when it occurred?" Mr. Denton paused. "Because I heard it," he said. Mrs. Henshaw frowned. "From here?" Mr. Denton nodded. "I was in the tower," he said, "maintaining the mechanism." Purbright considered this. "And did you hear anything unusual that night?" Mr. Denton hesitated. "Yes," he said quietly. The room stilled. He continued. "I heard voices in the hall afterwards, after most people had left." Purbright's tone remained even. "What did you hear?" Mr. Denton looked briefly uncomfortable. "Mr. Calder speaking," he said, "about reconciliation." The vicar closed his eyes for a moment. Mr. Denton continued. "He said something about ensuring only one version remained active." A faint wind moved through the tower, though nothing had opened. Purbright nodded once, slowly. "And after that?" he asked. Mr. Denton hesitated. "After that," he said, "I stopped attending meetings." A pause. Then Purbright spoke quietly. "It seems," he said, "that absence is becoming a common outcome." No one replied, and somewhere below them, in the parish hall, the village continued behaving as though only one version of its reality had ever been required. The parish office filing cabinet had developed a reputation for honesty over the years, which was unfortunate, because it had never been honest, only consistent. Mrs. Henshaw stood in front of it with the expression of someone preparing to argue with furniture that had already made up its mind. Inspector Purbright was beside her, watching rather than assisting. Reverend Crowthorne remained at the doorway, as though entering fully might imply endorsement of whatever they found. The cabinet drawers were labelled with reassuring simplicity: minutes, accounts, correspondence, miscellaneous. It was the miscellaneous drawer that had begun to attract attention, as such drawers inevitably do. Mrs. Henshaw pulled it open. Inside were folders, loose papers, and the mild chaos of administrative optimism. Purbright did not touch anything yet. Instead, he asked, "When was this last properly reviewed?" Mrs. Henshaw replied, without looking up, That depends on which version of properly you mean. A faint pause followed. Then she added, officially, last month. Unofficially, whenever Mr. Calder passes through. The vicar frowned. He does not maintain this office, he said. No, Mrs. Henshaw agreed. He improves it. That word again, improves, settled uneasily in the room. Purbright watched her sift through the papers with careful restraint. What are you looking for? He asked. A missing letter, she said. The vicar blinked. There are many missing letters in villages, he said. Most of them are eventually found in tea tins. This one, Mrs. Henshaw replied, was recorded in the correspondence log, then removed. Purbright's attention sharpened slightly. Recorded, then removed, he repeated. Yes, she said, which is not supposed to be possible without annotation. Mr. Henshaw leaned closer. What did it concern? Mrs. Henshaw hesitated briefly. The allotments, she said, and a formal objection to the revised boundaries. The vicar exhaled slowly. Whose objection? Mrs. Henshaw did not answer immediately. Then she said, Mr. Denton's. A quiet shift passed through the room. Purbright looked at her. You are saying Mr. Denton wrote formally, he said, and the record of that was removed. Yes. And replaced? He asked. Mrs. Henshaw paused. I am saying, she replied carefully, that it is no longer present in any current version of the correspondence file. The vicar looked troubled. That would suggest deliberate interference, he said. Mrs. Henshaw glanced at him. It would suggest, she corrected, selective preservation. Purbright stepped closer to the cabinet. Show me the log, he said. Mrs. Henshaw handed him a slim register. He opened it slowly. Entries were neat, predictable, comforting in the way well-trained handwriting often is. He traced down the column. Here, he said quietly. He tapped a line. Letter of objection, received Mr. Denton. The vicar leaned in. And then? He asked. Mrs. Henshaw pointed to the next entry. Removed pending reconciliation, she said. Purbright looked up slightly. That is not standard phrasing, he said. It has become standard here, Mrs. Henshaw replied. Mr. Henshaw frowned. Who authorizes removal pending reconciliation? Mrs. Henshaw answered without hesitation. Mr. Calder. A silence followed. Not dramatic. Administrative. Purbright closed the log gently. And the physical letter? He asked. Mrs. Henshaw exhaled. That is the problem, she said. It was filed here, then it was not. The vicar looked increasingly uneasy. Do we have any proof it existed at all? He asked. Mrs. Henshaw gave a faint, tight smile. That depends, she said, on which version of the record you trust. Purbright did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the filing cabinet as though it might reveal an alternative opinion. Then, he said, when was the last reconciliation performed? Mrs. Henshaw hesitated. Shortly after the harvest supper, she said. Purbright nodded once. And what does reconciliation mean here? Mr. Henshaw answered this time. It means, he said slowly, aligning all records to a single accepted version. Purbright's tone remained even. And what happens to the versions that do not align? Mrs. Henshaw answered quietly. They are not retained. The vicar rubbed his hands together once, as though trying to restore warmth to a concept that had cooled. This is becoming very difficult to follow, he admitted. Purbright looked at him. That is often how clarity feels, he said. A faint knock came at the door. It opened before permission was given. Mr. Calder entered. He glanced at the filing cabinet, then at the group, as though confirming something had progressed according to expectation. I was told, he said, that there was confusion regarding correspondence. Mrs. Henshaw's tone was controlled. There is missing documentation, she said. Mr. Calder nodded once. There is corrected documentation, he replied. Purbright watched him carefully. Where does the missing letter go? He asked. Mr. Calder considered the question. "It is not appropriate," he said, "to retain documents that have been superseded." Mr. Henshaw stepped forward. "Superseded by what authority?" Mr. Calder turned to him. "By correction," he said simply. The vicar spoke quietly. "Mr. Calder," he said, "Mr. Denton believes he wrote an objection that no longer exists in the record." Mr. Calder nodded again. "Then he is remembering an earlier version of the administrative structure," he said. Mrs. Henshaw's voice tightened. "He has a copy." Mr. Calder looked at her. "Copies are often misleading," he said. Purbright stepped slightly forward now. "Are you saying the letter was never valid?" he asked. Mr. Calder paused. "I am saying," he replied carefully, "that it did not align with the corrected ledger." The room fell into a silence that felt less like absence and more like agreement waiting to be chosen. Purbright studied him for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You do not remove disagreement in a system like this." Mr. Calder met his gaze. "You reconcile it?" he said, and for the first time, the word did not sound administrative. It sounded final. Inspector Purbright did not write notes because he feared forgetting. He wrote them because other people remembered selectively. The church office had emptied slightly after Mr. Calder's departure, though no one had agreed whether he had actually left or merely stopped being present in the usual way. That uncertainty, Purbright noted privately, had begun to feel structural rather than incidental. He sat alone at the desk now. The others had drifted into adjacent rooms under the polite excuse of tea, air, or thinking things through, which in Elmridge usually meant thinking in separate directions. Purbright opened his notebook. On the first page, he wrote, "Multiple record versions acknowledged, but not treated as contradictory by key figure." He paused, then added, "Contradiction replaced with reconciliation process." A faint noise came from the corridor footsteps, hesitant, then stopping, as though the building itself was being consulted for permission to proceed. The vicar appeared in the doorway. "You are making notes," he said, unnecessarily. "I am," Purbright agreed. The vicar hesitated. "Do they help?" "They prevent me from relying on other people's summaries," Purbright replied. That seemed to satisfy him only partially. He entered the room slowly. "I have been thinking," he said. "That remains the village's most active occupation," Purbright observed. The vicar gave a faint, tired look that might once have been amusement. "I do not understand, Mr. Calder," he admitted. "That is not unusual," Purbright said. The vicar frowned slightly. "That is not reassuring." "It was not intended to be." A pause followed. Then the vicar spoke more quietly. "He speaks as though disagreement is temporary," he said, "as though it simply needs to be brought into alignment." Purbright turned a page in his notebook. "And what do you believe disagreement is?" The vicar hesitated. "I used to think it was a difference of opinion," he said. "And now?" A longer pause. "Now I am not sure it survives documentation," he said. Purbright wrote something down. The vicar watched him. "You are not surprised," he said. "I am rarely surprised by villages," Purbright replied. "Only by how long they take to admit what they are already doing." The vicar shifted slightly. "There is something else," he said. Purbright looked up. "Go on." "The harvest supper," the vicar said. "I keep returning to it." "That is where most things have been returning," Purbright noted. The vicar frowned. "I remember Mr. Calder speaking to several people," he said. "Individually, not in groups." Purbright's pen paused. "About what?" The vicar hesitated. "Corrections," he said, "and reconciliation." Purbright waited. The vicar continued, more carefully now. "But I also remember something else. Something I did not include in my earlier account." Purbright's gaze lifted slightly. "Why not?" The vicar looked uncomfortable. "Because it did not feel like it belonged with the others," he said. "That is often where important details hide," Purbright said. The vicar exhaled slowly. He said. The vicar continued. that when a village holds multiple versions of itself, it does not become confused. It becomes inefficient. Purbright's expression remained neutral. And your interpretation? The vicar hesitated. That he sees inconsistency as something to be removed, he said. Purbright closed his notebook. That is one interpretation, he agreed. The vicar looked at him. You have another. Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the window. The churchyard outside was calm, in the way villages always were when they believed nothing was currently being decided about them. Tell me, Purbright said, when records are corrected here, what happens to the people attached to the incorrect version? The vicar hesitated. They are informed, he said. And then? The vicar hesitated again. They adjust, he said. Purbright turned slightly. And if they do not? The vicar did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly, they become difficult to place within the system. Purbright nodded once, as though this confirmed something already suspected. A knock came again. This time softer. Mrs. Henshaw entered. She looked more tense than before, as though she had been listening to silence rather than conversation. I have found something, she said. Purbright turned. She held a single sheet of paper, not a letter, not quite a form, something in between. It was not in the file, she said. It was behind it. Mr. Henshaw appeared behind her, slightly out of breath. It was folded, he added, very deliberately. Mrs. Henshaw placed it on the desk. Purbright did not touch it immediately. He read the heading. Then he looked up. This is not correspondence, he said. Mrs. Henshaw nodded. It is a reconciliation summary, she said. The vicar leaned in. What does it reconcile? He asked. Purbright read silently for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. It reconciles people to a single version of the allotment structure. Mr. Henshaw frowned. And those who do not match that version? Purbright looked at him. They are marked as inconsistent, he said. The room went still. Mrs. Henshaw spoke carefully. That is what Mr. Denton would have been classified as, she said. The vicar looked shaken. This is not how administration normally works, he said. Purbright looked at him. No, he agreed. He paused. It is how systems work when they decide disagreement is a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be managed. A silence followed. Not heavy, just final in its shape. Purbright folded the paper gently and placed it back on the desk. Then he said, very quietly, I think we should speak again to Mr. Calder. And for the first time, no one asked what there was left to clarify. Choir practice at St. Anselm's had always been more about endurance than harmony. It was held on Thursdays, a day chosen not for musical suitability, but because it sat inconveniently between everything else, ensuring full attendance from those who could not convincingly excuse themselves. The church nave was half lit, half ignored. Candles had been lit out of habit rather than necessity, creating the impression that something more ceremonial was taking place than anyone felt qualified to confirm. Mrs. Larkin sat at the organ, though she rarely played more than she supervised. The choir stood in uneven rows, each person holding a hymn book as though it might offer moral protection. Inspector Purbright stood at the back. He did not disrupt rehearsals. He observed how they disrupted themselves. Reverend Crowthorne sat beside him, trying not to look as though he was counting attendance in a spiritual sense. Mrs. Henshaw and Mr. Henshaw stood near the aisle, both present but not aligned in posture or expectation. Mr. Denton was absent. No one stated this immediately. In Elmridge, absence was treated as a topic that required preparation. Mrs. Larkin tapped the organ lightly. We will begin, she announced, with the revised version of Psalm 42. A faint rustle passed through the choir. Mr. Henshaw frowned. Revised version? He murmured. Mrs. Henshaw replied without looking at him. It has been adjusted, she said. The vicar, standing near the altar, raised a hand slightly. Adjusted how? He asked. Mrs. Larkin hesitated. According to the latest liturgical alignment, she said. Purbright noted the phrasing without expression. The choir began. It did not go well, though not in any unusual way. Halfway through the second verse, the back door opened. It was not a dramatic entrance. Nothing in Elmridge ever entered dramatically without later apologizing. Mr. Calder stepped inside. The singing did not stop immediately. It faltered first, as though recognizing an instruction it had not yet agreed to follow. Mrs. Larkin's hands paused above the organ keys. The vicar turned slowly. Mr. Calder nodded politely. "I apologize for interrupting," he said. No one had agreed to that yet, Mr. Henshaw muttered under his breath. Purbright stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, simply in recognition. Mr. Calder's gaze settled on him briefly. "I understand there are questions regarding reconciliation summaries," Mr. Calder said. Mrs. Henshaw stiffened slightly. "We found a document," she said. "Yes," Mr. Calder replied. "That is expected." The vicar frowned. "It was hidden," he said. Mr. Calder considered this. "It was archived appropriately," he corrected. Purbright studied him. "Why was it behind the file?" he asked. Mr. Calder's expression remained steady. "Because it predates the current structure of reference," he said. A faint pause followed. Mrs. Larkin spoke, her voice uncertain. "We were in the middle of practice," she said. Mr. Calder turned toward her. "Then please continue," he said politely. No one did. The silence that followed felt less like interruption and more like permission had been withdrawn. Purbright spoke quietly. "You have been aligning records," he said. Mr. Calder nodded. "That is correct." "Across how many systems?" Purbright asked. Mr. Calder did not hesitate. "All relevant parish systems," he said. "Accounts, allotments, attendance, correspondence, and membership records." The vicar's voice tightened slightly. "And when those systems disagree?" Mr. Calder replied calmly. "They are reconciled." Mrs. Henshaw stepped forward. "You are removing versions that do not match," she said. Mr. Calder corrected her gently. "I am ensuring consistency," he said. Mr. Henshaw gave a short, bitter exhale. "That is the same thing with different vocabulary," he said. Mr. Calder looked at him. "Vocabulary determines understanding," he replied. Purbright watched him for a moment longer. Then he said, "And those who do not align with the final version?" A pause. "Not long, but precise," Mr. Calder answered. "They are no longer referenced within the active structure." The choir remained silent behind them, hymn books still open, as though waiting for permission to become relevant again. The vicar spoke quietly. "You are describing removal," he said. Mr. Calder replied, "I am describing resolution." Mrs. Larkin's voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Denton is not attending choir," she said. Mr. Calder nodded once. "That is consistent," he said. A quiet tension moved through the nave. Mrs. Henshaw's voice sharpened. "Consistent with what?" Mr. Calder looked at her. "With his current classification," he said. That word classification hung in the air in a way no hymn could soften. Purbright stepped forward slightly. "I think," he said calmly, "we are beyond administrative language now." Mr. Calder looked at him. "I am only using precise terminology," he said. Purbright nodded. "Precisely," he agreed. A pause. Then Purbright asked, very gently, "When was the last time Mr. Denton was reclassified?" A faint hesitation appeared. Not uncertainty, something closer to calculation. "Shortly after the harvest supper," Mr. Calder said. The vicar closed his eyes briefly. Mrs. Henshaw whispered, almost to herself, "That night again." Purbright continued, unhurried. "And before that?" Mr. Calder replied, "He was provisionally aligned." Mr. Henshaw frowned. "That is not a human description," he said. Mr. Calder answered evenly, "It is a functional one." The choir remained motionless, as though waiting for the system to decide whether singing still counted as participation. Purbright looked toward the back of the church. Then he said quietly, "I think we should speak with Mr. Denton directly." Mr. Calder did not respond immediately. When he did, his tone remained polite. "That may not be necessary," he said. And for the first time, something in the room suggested that necessary was no longer defined by those present. Mr. Denton was found where he had always been easiest to overlook, behind the churchyard wall, where the grass grew unevenly and the wind behaved as though it had not yet decided on direction. He was not hiding, he was simply not participating. Inspector Purbright stood a few paces away, allowing the moment to settle into its own shape before deciding what it was. Reverend Crowthorne lingered behind him, visibly uncertain whether pastoral concern or procedural anxiety was required. Mrs. Henshaw arrived first, followed by Mr. Henshaw and then Mrs. Larkin, who had insisted that choir practice should not continue under interpretive uncertainty. Mr. Calder was not present. No one commented on that immediately. Mr. Denton looked up when they approached, but without alarm. "That was quicker than expected," he said. Purbright replied, "We did not hurry." A faint, dry smile crossed Mr. Denton's face. "That is usually how things feel from my position," he said. He remained seated on the low stone edge of the wall, hands resting loosely in front of him. Nothing about him suggested concealment, only detachment. Purbright observed him carefully. "You have been reclassified," he said. Mr. Denton nodded once. "Yes," he replied. The simplicity of the answer unsettled Mrs. Henshaw more than denial would have. "And you accepted that?" she asked. Mr. Denton looked at her briefly. "I did not accept it," he said. "It happened." A silence followed. Not heavy, accurate. The vicar stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Denton," he said gently, "do you understand what is being suggested?" Mr. Denton exhaled slowly. "I understand," he said, "that I no longer appear in the current version of things." Purbright tilted his head slightly. "That is one way of phrasing it," he said. Mr. Denton nodded. "It is the simplest," he replied. Mr. Henshaw frowned. "What about your objection letter?" he asked. Mr. Denton blinked. "It was removed," he said. "By whom?" Mrs. Henshaw asked sharply. Mr. Denton hesitated only briefly. "By reconciliation," he said. Mrs. Larkin let out a quiet sound of frustration. "That word keeps appearing as though it explains itself," she said. Mr. Denton looked at her. "In practice," he said, "it does." Purbright stepped closer. "Explain it to me anyway," he said. Mr. Denton considered. "It means," he said carefully, "that when two versions of a record exist, one is selected as the current reference and the other is retired." "And what determines selection?" Purbright asked. Mr. Denton hesitated. "Authority," he said. A pause. Then Mrs. Henshaw said quietly, "And Mr. Calder defines that authority." Mr. Denton did not disagree. The wind moved again, brushing the grass against the wall in uneven patterns. Purbright looked toward the church. "When did this begin?" he asked. Mr. Denton thought for a moment. "After the first audit cycle," he said, "when inconsistencies were identified across parish systems." The vicar frowned. "There have always been minor inconsistencies," he said. Mr. Denton nodded. "Yes," he agreed, "but they were previously tolerated." A faint, uneasy silence followed that word. "Tolerated." Purbright spoke again. "And now?" Mr. Denton looked down briefly. "Now they are resolved," he said. Mrs. Henshaw's voice was quiet but firm. "By removing them?" Mr. Denton answered simply. "By aligning them." Mr. Henshaw shook his head slightly. "That is not alignment," he said. "That is replacement." Mr. Denton looked at him without hostility. "In practice," he said, "they are the same outcome." The vicar spoke softly. "Mr. Denton, do you feel erased?" A pause, longer than before. Then Mr. Denton said, "I feel unreferenced." That word landed differently. Not emotional, Structural. Purbright studied him for a moment longer. Then he asked, "Do you still possess your original copy of the allotment agreement?" Mr. Denton shook his head. "No," he said. "It was collected." "By whom?" "Mr. Calder," he said. Mrs. Henshaw looked increasingly tense. "And you allowed that?" Mr. Denton gave a faint shrug. "I was told it was no longer active," he said. Purbright's voice remained even. "And you did not object further?" Mr. Denton looked at him. "I already had," he said. "Once. That objection was removed." A silence followed. The implication was not spoken aloud, but it settled anyway. Mrs. Larkin spoke quietly. "So people who disagree lose their records." Mr. Denton nodded once. "Yes," he said, "eventually." The vicar looked troubled. "That cannot be lawful," he said. Mr. Denton replied gently, "It is procedural." Purbright looked back toward the churchyard gate. "And Mr. Calder considers this maintenance," he said. Mr. Denton answered, "He considers it necessary." A long pause followed. Then Purbright said, almost quietly, "Necessary for what remains consistent." No one responded, because the answer, now, felt uncomfortably close. Mrs. Henshaw finally spoke. "There is something we have not asked," she said. All eyes turned to her. She looked at Mr. Denton. "After you were reclassified," she said, "what happens to people like you?" Mr. Denton considered this. "They are no longer part of active reference," he said. "And in practical terms?" she pressed. Mr. Denton looked at Purbright this time. "That depends," he said, "on whether anyone still remembers the earlier version." A silence followed that was not emotional. It was definitional. Purbright nodded slowly. Then he said, "Thank you." It was not clear whether he meant for the information or the clarity it brought. He turned slightly toward the church, and for the first time, his tone carried something close to final understanding. "Now," he said quietly, "we need to speak to Mr. Calder about what remains when everything inconsistent has been removed." And behind them, the village of Elmridge continued behaving as though only one version of itself had ever required defending. The church was empty, in the way buildings become empty only after they have recently contained too many careful thoughts. St. Anselm's nave held the faint aftertaste of choir practice, arguments that had tried to remain polite, and decisions that had not yet agreed on their own final shape. Reverend Crowthorne stood near the altar, hands loosely clasped, as though waiting for the building to correct him. Mrs. Henshaw and Mr. Henshaw sat apart in the same pew, which in Elmridge was considered a form of agreement under strain. Mrs. Larkin remained near the organ, though she had not touched it since the last hymn stopped behaving like a hymn. Mr. Denton had been taken back into the village conversation in a way that felt provisional rather than resolved. Inspector Purbright stood at the centre aisle. Mr. Calder stood near the lectern. Neither had chosen a dominant position. That, Purbright noted, was often more revealing than those who did. "You asked to speak with me," Mr. Calder said calmly. "I did," Purbright replied. A pause followed. "Not hostile, simply waiting for definition." Purbright continued. "I want to understand the structure you are applying," he said. Mr. Calder inclined his head slightly. "It is not complex," he replied. "It is consistent." "That," Purbright said, "is often where complexity hides." No one spoke for a moment. Then Purbright walked slowly toward the lectern. "When you identify inconsistency," he said, "you remove it from the record." Mr. Calder corrected gently, "I align it." Purbright nodded once. "And what happens to the version that does not align?" Mr. Calder replied without hesitation. "It ceases to be current." Mrs. Henshaw shifted slightly in the pew. "That is not the same as it ceasing to exist," she said. Mr. Calder looked at her. "In practical terms, it is," he said. A faint tension moved through the nave. Purbright looked at him for a moment longer than before. "Tell me about the ledger correction," he said quietly. Mr. Calder paused. It is the point at which discrepancies were standardized, he said. And before that? Purbright asked. Before that, Mr. Calder replied, there were competing records. Purbright nodded. Yes, he said, there were. He turned slightly. Mr. Denton had one version. The council had another. The correspondence file had a third. Mr. Calder did not deny this. Purbright continued. And the reconciliation process selected one as primary. Yes, Mr. Calder said. Purbright's voice remained calm. And the others? Mr. Calder answered evenly. They were archived. Mrs. Larkin spoke quietly. They were removed, she said. Mr. Calder corrected her gently. They were no longer active. Purbright turned back to him. You keep using language that avoids disappearance, he said. Mr. Calder considered this. I use precise language, he replied. Purbright nodded once. Let us be precise, then, he said. He looked directly at Mr. Calder. After the harvest supper, you performed a reconciliation that affected allotment records, correspondence, and membership classification. Yes, Mr. Calder said. And following that, Purbright continued, Mr. Denton's objection letter ceased to appear in any active record. Mr. Calder replied, it was superseded. And Mr. Denton himself, Purbright said quietly, ceased to appear in active reference. A faint pause. Then Mr. Calder said, his status was updated. The vicar spoke softly. Updated to what? Mr. Calder turned slightly toward him. Non-reference, he said. A silence followed. Not dramatic. Structural. Mrs. Henshaw's voice tightened. And what does that mean in human terms? Mr. Calder replied. It means decisions are no longer dependent on his input. Mr. Denton stood at the back of the nave, finally speaking. It means I stopped existing in meetings I used to attend, he said quietly. No one corrected him. Purbright watched Mr. Calder carefully now. You do not see this as removal, he said. Mr. Calder shook his head. No, he replied. It is correction. Purbright nodded slowly. And correction requires authority, Mr. Calder answered. It requires consistency. A faint pause. Then Purbright said, Tell me something I think only the vicar has noticed. The vicar looked up, startled. Mr. Calder did not react. Purbright continued. The phrase you used at the harvest supper, ledger, correction, was not recorded in any official minutes. Mr. Calder replied calmly. Minutes are summaries. Yes, Purbright said, and summaries exclude what they cannot stabilize. A quiet stillness followed. Then Purbright turned slightly toward Reverend Crowthorne. Vicar, he said gently, what did you actually hear that night? The vicar hesitated. All attention shifted to him. He swallowed once. I heard Mr. Calder speaking, he said slowly. After most people had left. And? Purbright asked. The vicar hesitated again. He said. The vicar continued. That inconsistency is not an error in a village system. A pause. It is a risk. Mrs. Larkin frowned. That sounds harmless, she said. The vicar shook his head slightly. It was the way he said it, he replied, as though risk required removal rather than management. Purbright nodded once. And that is what you reported as a ledger correction reference, he said. The vicar looked down. Yes, he admitted. Mr. Calder's expression remained steady. I said nothing incorrect, he said. Purbright looked at him. No, he agreed quietly. You did not. A pause. Then Purbright added, That is the problem. The church felt still now in a different way. Not quiet, decided. Purbright stepped closer to the lectern. When everything inconsistent is removed, he said, what remains? Mr. Calder replied without hesitation. Order. Purbright nodded slowly. And if the inconsistency was the only record of a person's existence? Silence. Mr. Calder did not answer immediately. That was the first time Purbright noted that he had not responded at once. The vicar spoke quietly. "Inspector." Purbright raised a hand gently. "No," he said. He looked at Mr. Calder. "You did not erase Mr. Denton," he said. A pause. "You redefined what counted as him." Mrs. Henshaw inhaled sharply. Mr. Henshaw said nothing. Mrs. Larkin looked between them, unsettled. Mr. Calder finally spoke. "I ensured coherence," he said. Purbright nodded once. "And coherence," he replied, "requires agreement about what is allowed to remain real." A long silence followed. Then Purbright closed his notebook. He looked around the church at the pews, the faces, the quiet strain of a village that had begun to suspect its own documentation. Finally, he said, very calmly, "I think the most important thing Mr. Calder heard that night was not spoken aloud at all." Mr. Calder's gaze held steady. "And what was that?" he asked. Purbright looked at him. "That disagreement," he said quietly, "was not something to be corrected." A pause. "It was something to be heard." The silence that followed was not the end of the argument. It was the moment the village realized it had been keeping only one version of itself on record for too long